Thanks, speaker, for the speech. And we now invite the final speaker, constructive speaker of the committee.
There we go.
Calling Mr. Speaker went like this. When an aerosol corporation, which was operating under a limited budget derived out of the fact that there was demand for cheaper aerosol cans, which essentially disabled them from having access to the profit, that would have allowed them an air filter, which would have cleaned up the exhaust that came out of their factory. What they essentially say is that you want access to the capital, which would have mitigated their very own harms without appeasing the shareholders which they originate from. That's why we feel they were completely undynamic in the setup that Bass presented. Not only did they want to talk about instances which could have been easily mitigated with a simple application and execution of law, they also wanted to talk about in a vacuum the idea that capital was of access even if capital was the very thing that you have to sacrifice on your side of the house. They're not fulfilling that burden, they want everything in this debate, and that's why we feel, Mr. Speaker, that they need to do a lot of reconciliation in their final speech before we hear replies. First issue I want to talk about is the idea of social society and law, and why exactly it's something adequate that we meet these expectations. Let's use Imran's example. He talked about the use of the commons, right? He tried to rebuild this coming from his leader of opposition. We say, Mr. Speaker, that the idea of the commons derives from the idea that it's shared property. So why does that responsibility have to be compounded when it comes to corporations?
On that point.
You see, Mr. Speaker, we're arguing in a paradigm where we have corporations that pay tax.
Okay,
we have corporations that are already under a lot of mechanisms in the status quo that make sure they follow laws. And we say, Mr. Speaker, that under contract, they've already met the part of the deal. No, thank you. So that means, Mr. Speaker, if you're advocating that they should pay for more tax, then that means that that's a problem of the initial contract. That doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, that we should compound an extra moral obligation, because if you think about it, those were the terms of agreement. You need, Mr. Speaker, no thank you, to adjust those initial terms, especially when you're also dealing with Bass's second point. The idea that these corporations are allowed because of the social benefit and social good. How can that social good happen, Mr. Speaker, when you have to sacrifice their very products and goods and services in order to bring about those corporate social responsibility acts that they argue? Because if you think about it, there will always be a trade-off. There will always be an exchange and someone has to lose. Essentially what they say is, it's better to make consumers lose, it's better to make corporations lose, because at the end of the day, it's more important that the tokenistic idea of the environment be protected. No thank you. That neglects the context we're working with. Because it isn't a corporation that fuels that desire to burn down trees, it's the desire of people for cheaper products, for better products, that makes that happen. No thank you. So let's take the best endgame scenario. The best endgame scenario happens when individual companies are tied to more moral obligations, no thank you, but people still demand their products. So this is the problem-solution mismatch in the second part of this issue. We say, Mr. Speaker, no thank you. Tell it to Raymond. We say that a charity project, Mr. Speaker, will have better corporate social responsibility maybe. People in Africa will have Macs. But that still means that these corporations will still need computers to give to these individuals. They're still going to use sweatshops. So essentially, they're diverting the solution to their very own problem. No thank you. Why is it then marginally better, or actually no, widely comparatively better on the side of the house? Dwight talked about warping the social discourse, about how you want to make it so that people know that when the buying stops, the killing stops too. There was no response to the idea that it was invisibilized, that people have a stake in this problem, and when you continue that invisibility, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, people will still keep buying these products, and at the end of the day, you solve nothing. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we need to establish extra stakeholdership or deeper stakeholdership with people. And it goes back to Bass's example about McDonald's. If you think about it, you will get fat regardless of how many scholars McDonald's sends to school. You only stop getting fat, no thank you. You only stop getting cancer the moment you realize it's your very own volition that created this problem for you. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we feel the moral obligation was met when initial terms were signed. That means that their problem wasn't solved. But the last part of this issue, no thank you, is the idea that Imran gave when he told us about how it's better to choose the environment because people need to have a paradigm of thought that involves other stakeholders. We agree. Mr. Speaker, processes and modes of production are independent of this idea. So that means that it's purely rhetorical that they have this idea of paradigm of thought, but for as long as people and consumers demand for these kinds of products, they will still need to use these same modes of production. That means, Mr. Speaker, that corporate social responsibility is tokenistic at best, and you need to improve the gravity of that solution before it's fungible and tangible. Go.
If you concede that everybody has an equal stake in the property of the commons, and considering that companies disproportionately benefit from them, why is there no moral obligation?
You think they disproportionately benefit because you didn't pay attention to the arguments cascade. If you look at the two chaebol we mentioned in South Korea about Hyundai and Samsung, Korean society was warped around the idea that they contribute jobs and better technology to the market. And this is the trade-off, or the second issue we want to talk about. The idea of corporations being able to fulfill their current social function. Why do you hammer that? It's because, Mr. Speaker, let's concede, if off the bat we could have a world where we didn't need corporations, we probably wouldn't want them because maybe philosophically they are malevolent. But the idea is we continue to allow them for as long as they provide us with social utility and social benefit. No, thank you. These social utility and social benefits include better products and more jobs. That means, Mr. Speaker, that the first priority has to be to the agency that provides them with a mechanism to continue that propagation. Let's compare. If you prioritize corporate social responsibility, Mr. Speaker, you entirely have to go into the trade-off that you sacrifice your modes of production and you sacrifice the products you create. So when you buy a Starbucks cup, no thank you, instead of enjoying it at 50 cents less, essentially you're paying 50 cents more so you can improve this mechanism and you can improve this rhetoric that, hey, we're taking care of farmers. That means no thank you. You're not victimizing corporation and their model, which they want because of rhetorical justice. You're victimizing consumers who depend on these institutions for better products and cleaner products. And that, Mr. Speaker, we feel is morally ambiguous. But why do we want to extend this analysis to becoming morally malevolent? It's because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we want to prioritize shareholders because it's the idea of consent and free will that ties back down to why people have to pay the price. Because essentially, corporations would never have had to go through these processes if people didn't want these products. So the idea of profitism, Mr. Speaker, the idea that you have to make a profit rests on the idea that people will continue buying your products and people will continue patronizing you. That means, Mr. Speaker, that they can't hold them fully accountable. But why is the compromise best on our side of the house? It's because for as long as we continue the mechanisms in the status quo that include laws and execution, and for as long as we hold them back to what society consents to, then we're meeting a balanced contract, where corporations can continue to innovate and produce better developed products, and at the same time people can dictate the terms of agreement. But that balance is offset, and essentially you make them fail to do their jobs when you hold a moral obligation that basically paralyzes them. And this is the analysis I want to leave you with. What good is a corporation that has to sell you more expensive products for the price of rhetoric and for the price of thinking better about yourself? We say, Mr. Speaker, we have to tie back to its original function because that's the only way that we continue the purpose and function of corporations because we never wanted to allow them anyway. And for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we feel we're more practical and principled, and that's why even if KIDA's comment comes every 500 years, we think that NUSA will also lose. Because, like KIDA's comment. See, 175?
There.
5 minutes.
Well, we thank the speaker for the speech. We now invite the speaker for all the opposition.
You're here.
We can see that there's a big possibility for the corporation's nature to do profiteering leads to social benefits. Because in those cases, Mr. Speaker, that's not really the debate. Because if you take a look at all those benefits, they're just maybe trickle-down repercussions of the profiteering itself. That's why the debate is much more complicated than that. It's not just about giving out computers. It's about more complicated issues when you have highly contentious areas, when you're talking about legal aspects and technically not violations using their definition, but still do social harms and still promote social inequality. The question of the debate is, in cases where the profiteering is not already enough of a regulating mechanism for you to say that the corporations are really doing what is socially just, what is morally just, and what it ought to do with people, why is it that you have to yield to your own selfish shareholders who are just living in their villas and don't experience the lives of the normal miners in action or in the Philippines? We say, Mr. Speaker, that it's wrong if you have standards such as just illegality or the active effort to do harm or like the only means of doing it. It's much more complicated than that. We need to situate the debate and nuance the debate in a globalized context when we're talking about asymmetrical power relations between corporations, states, and people. We just cannot simply say that we have 3 factors and the factors can be equal. It's very unfair to put people at the equal position of a corporation and just tell them, it's your fault. You don't question the corporation, you still give them the demand. You do not expect people to do this when to begin with, the structural premises where they exist in the society is already unfair, and these corporations are already put up in a pedestal, and hence these kinds of differing discourses, according to Dwight, is very much unfair to begin with. That's why the debate is not as simple as Ateneo imagines it to be. Two issues in today's debate. First is, in the context of an unbalanced power of state and corporation relationships, where should corporations actually stand? Second is, in the issue of the people, what really is the expectation that we have in these people, and what really is the best way of regulating their interests? First, they said, well, corporations do not have corporations do not have the moral obligation because they follow the laws anyway. How I wish the laws were as simple as that. But we are talking about, Mr. Speaker, when we have highly contentious areas of either there are loopholes of the law, which is what MNCs do to third world countries, especially mining, for example, because they know that the laws are not as mature as the first world laws, which is why they go to those countries and exploit the loopholes of the law, which is, by the way, because the law hasn't existed yet, it is still technically legal. They know that it is wrong, but they still choose to do it because they are excused from doing so. The second scenario is when they exploit what the law doesn't explicitly provide. Such as, for example, what Starbucks did in 2006. It is with all their legal right to say and to block the application of Ethiopia when Ethiopia tried to do a US patent application, US trademark, not patent, application of their coffee beans. Yes, it is legal, but it doesn't mean to say that it's right. When you talk about your coffee being brought there, why does it have to be the case when only Starbucks benefits and not Ethiopia as well? That's why, Mr. Speaker, in those highly contentious areas, the problem is if you have these corporations, because of their profit motivation and because of the limited perspectives of their shareholders, would not do all of these social benefits anymore. And we think that is a very big problem. Because in this debate, we are talking about likelihoods. We're talking about likely guarantees. And in their scenario, if it's only profit, and there's already a conflict of interest in profit, so corporations will never do any social benefit, which would negate the whole substantive of BAS when BAS says, well, there's a social benefit anyway. Once the profit is gone, what will be the guarantee that we have? Answer that now.
Regardless of how much charity you do, Ethiopian laws will not work. Why does it have to be that corporations are punished when Americans themselves consented to having these abuses done?
Okay, people, second issue, I'll answer that later, I promise. But let me now continue. They said, well, the states are also complicit to this. Maybe the response to this is, yeah, they might be, but it doesn't negate the liability that corporations have, especially with the information that the source is there, and they know that there's a problem, they know that the future is uncertain for mining companies, for example, and they exploit on that loophole. We say, Mr. Speaker, that is wrong. When you talk about corporations profiting from their people, existing in our society, being put in a pedestal because of the people's support, we think that corporations ought to know better. We say, Mr. Speaker, yes, it might not be a legal binding thing, but it's an initiative that we would appreciate if these corporations exercise their moral duty to do so. But then Dwight has this argument, well, the space has to be unfair, because if it's unfair, if you impose values on these corporations, you harm things like free trade, for example. That's not necessarily true. That's why we always regulate corporations whenever we can. But in the likely events that we cannot predict future outcomes, for example, or when we have contentious values, we expect the corporations to act on their rational interest and to not use the space just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the society as well. That is why Imran's substantive, which they never responded to, holds so much water in the debate. The society right now, Mr. Speaker, puts them in an asymmetrical position where they are allowed to shape discourses, where they are allowed to do actual social change, but they don't do because they just rely on their shareholders' interest. That is the wrong thing that we don't want. It has to be fettered because the space is very much conducive for them to just abuse the people. Second issue on the people, they said social benefits exist. Yeah, maybe if I buy Nike, it means to say that I got my shoes, but it doesn't mean to say that the people in the sweatshops also got the social benefits, right? Or maybe when I buy, for example, Starbucks, yeah, I get the coffee, but it doesn't mean to say that it was just for Ethiopia as well. We say, Mr. Speaker, that social benefit is not as simple as they seem, that now we have free Samsung apps. We say, Mr. Speaker, you need to take a look at when these cases actually happen, when you have lobby groups, for example, who explain these kinds of cases. We say, Mr. Speaker, the problem here is that social benefit is a double-edged sword. Some people might have it, but many others don't have that as well. That's why, Mr. Speaker, even if they really benefit from these things, it doesn't mean to say that it is right for you to just exploit the people. Yes, they might say, well, we're giving 30 cents to the farmers anyway. But what is so wrong with giving 70 cents when it doesn't harm your corporation to begin with? There is no harm to these corporations, but it means a lot to these people, and still the corporations don't choose to do that because there was demand. And now I want to debunk the idea that it's the people's fault too. The power problem here, Mr. Speaker, is that information is asymmetrical. When you talk about monopolies, for example, when you have companies like P&Gs and Unilever who have niche markets, for example, and just control the economy of the markets, it's not as if the people really have a choice to ban P&G. We say, Mr. Speaker, that the problem there is that monopolies, for example, are the very strength of these corporations, don't allow these people to have voices as well. They in fact manufacture the consent of these people because they create a culture of reliance. They make the people believe that this is the only way that you can be rich. That is the rhetoric that they use for third world mining, that you can never have the capital to do this. We say, Mr. Speaker, if they say that the capital is the problem, there's no incentive for corporations to provide capital and make the living sustainable for your miners. Because if that happens, that will be at the expense of the corporations, right? They will never provide any long-term and sustainable development in their scenario. It's going to be abusive and oppressive, even if it's by the law allowed. We say, Mr. Speaker, we need to side on social justice here. These corporations have to be disciplined, and the initiative should come from them.
Right, thanks Speaker for your speech. We now move to the replies and start with the opposition.
See, Mr. Speaker, there are two fatal presumptions on that side of the House. The first was this idea that just because some benefits exist, therefore no moral obligations stand anymore. And this is fatal because if you want to defend profiteering or profiteerism as an absolute value, you've got to understand it doesn't just come with the benefits that you're talking about. Because if profiteerism is pursued at all costs, there comes a lot of harms as well. Think of example, at the expense of your workers, because your workers don't get medical benefits just to increase your profit margin. Think of example, not caring much about the environment because you want to degrade the environment as much as possible for short-term profits. We think that this balance is achieved when profiteerism is balanced out with the concern for other people and other stakeholders as well. The second fatal presumption on the side is that the only benefit worth having will be economic benefits. Think of example, jobs and MacBook computers in Africa. Because we think there are other things that are equally important as well, like the environment, like the people who make those MacBooks that you send to Africa. And that's a fatal presumption on their side of the house as well. Because we believe that point can be reached when we get both the economic benefits and the social benefits as well. And that point is reached when they owe a moral obligation and when they should owe a moral obligation to other actors within status quo. So how did the debate go? First, is there a moral obligation or not? What did we argue in side opposition? We argued, look, because you derive your profits from the property of the commons, people have a proprietary interest in your profits and therefore that's where the moral obligations come from. Second, the idea that you promise the people who have developed the legitimate expectations that you will go through the promises in terms of medical benefits and taking care of the community. Thirdly, the idea that the cities and the laws were created in a very specific fashion to support your ability to make profits, and therefore you owe a moral obligation there. Fourth, the fact that the people suffer disproportionately from your actions, right? If you were to get up and leave or to clean up after yourself, right? And these were all moral obligations, and I look forward to the reply speaker actually dealing with these points. But more to the point, what did they say, right? The only thing that they said was, first, but they pay taxes already anyway. But the response coming from our side was simple. If you concede that everybody has an equal stake in the property of the commons, and these companies disproportionately benefit, how is it fair that they just pay the minimal corporate taxes that you use to entice them into these areas in the first place? We think a lot more is owed. And secondly, the arguments coming from both Hong Yu and me, the idea that, look, your price mechanism isn't simple enough, right? Because the profits doesn't trickle back to the community or the people who need it. It goes to the people who are at the top of that corporation, not at the bottom, and that's where the moral obligation comes in. Not only that, we went further, we argued why they're better. We said this is the only way to help the people, because they're in the best position to achieve this kind of social utility, right? And to constantly engage them in a battle of circumventing these laws becomes problematic, because these corporations react faster than the government, and that's when the people suffer. Arguments coming from Hong Yu and me, that again I look forward to reply actually dealing with it. But what did they reply? In Darrow, isn't it better, right? Look, you're paying 50 cents more, 50% less. Just because your drink costs 50 cents less or 50 cents more doesn't mean that the farmers actually get those 50 cents. It goes back to Starbucks. The farmers don't get anything at all. We would rather that 50 cents actually be directly used to help these farmers, and that's where this debate lies. Next, what do they say? Oh, but the people asked for it because they wanted more stuff. we gave them more stuff, so if they suffered, they consented. But that's not true, right? Because we think that almost everybody basically owes a moral obligation. As much as the people have a moral obligation, you consented in that particular relationship and you were responsible as well. But we were far bolder than that. We argue they owe a specific obligation because there are instances where they do, and they are almost absolutely culpable or liable for the kind of atrocities that are foisted upon these communities. Then we argue that it's more reasonable to suggest in this house that these corporations were responsible rather than that side of the house that insists that corporations are whiter than white. Lastly, they never dealt with my argument about monopoly of information. Very, very sad that happened again for the 5th time running by teams that are facing us, because my substantives actually do matter. And for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, because they refuse to engage my arguments, because we sound a lot cooler and our arguments are a lot sharper, we win this debate.
Right, thank you very much. Final speech in this Octo finals. We invite KIDA on the final.
We would contest that mine and White's arguments sounded a lot clearer. The reason why they failed, coming from them, is they failed to recognize our response to the specific nuance that our frame gave us when we said that access to benefits when companies grow don't necessarily just affect the direct stakeholders within that company, don't just benefit the direct managers of Starbucks and whatnot, but also direct the people who these companies need in order to make sure that their profit grows. If you want to talk about Starbucks and Ethiopians, this is where the relative comparison fails. Because in a situation where the Starbucks companies weren't there, those Ethiopian farmers wouldn't get a better standard of living. They would probably be beholden to other landlords who would probably not give them as much or compensate their money as much. They would probably be beholden to a poor Ethiopian market who don't necessarily have enough demand for the supplies or money that they would give at the end of the day. So we think that these companies do have the direct responsibility, or they do have the positive incentive to sustain the other people who don't necessarily or who don't really belong to the top brackets or to the managers within that company. Because if you want to have efficient workers who make your products a lot more sellable, then you have the incentive to make sure that they do get medical benefits and they do get medical coverage in order for them to work longer and in order for them to make more efficient products for you. That's why if you take a look at it, if you take a look at the example of Nike, we think that those poor people without the company there wouldn't necessarily have a better standard of living because they didn't have education to begin with. And the only thing that kept them sustained and the only thing that fed their family was the very idea that Nike was there to employ. What did they talk about? They wanted to talk about how companies have the moral responsibility to fulfill other social obligations like to not degrade the environment. What we've told you is that that happens when these companies are allowed to fulfill their long-term responsibilities and when these companies are allowed to actually save up money in the long term. They failed to respond to the example that we gave about Hyundai. The very reason why they were allowed to make the first electric car, which wasn't dependent on fuel, which didn't degrade the environment, was because the government didn't put a heavy tax on them, and the government didn't tax the original carbon cars that they made. No response coming from their side of the house. There was also no response to the idea of social complicitness that Daryl and White talked about. Because what we've told you is, why is there an extra premium to put the sole moral obligation or to put the sole moral responsibility on the companies for the social ills of people, even if it was their very own breath actions that led to those social ills to begin with. We think if more trees are being cut down, why do we put sole responsibility on the companies when it's the people's practices of using these papers that made that happen? Why do we put the sole responsibilities of companies for people who had cancer from McDonald's when it was their very own consent to eat that much chicken to begin with? So if you take a look at the actual harm that they're talking about, it's downplayed. Why? One, they've already conceded to our frame that we're not doing any criminal acts. They've also conceded that they don't support, or they've also conceded that we should neglect those instances where loopholes happen. They've conceded that in principle those loopholes shouldn't happen. So what is the exclusive harm that they wanted to talk about? The only exclusive harm then is using a brown bean Starbucks that's not as environmentally friendly as using green bean products. And we think that's a downplayed harm in itself.
they wanted to talk about the property of the commons. That's a direct clash to my principled argumentation. What I've talked about is that the reason why these people, or the reason why these entrepreneurs should get their bang for the bucks, is because they use the property of the commons, and they use products, and they use their very own ingenuity to extend these products and services to people at the end of the day. We think that's enough social and moral responsibility. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much.